Here comes everybody. Hey, Stephanie. Hey, Brandon.
Good morning.
Dr. Richardson. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Charles, just let me know when you think we should begin.
I think we are about there. I do expect a couple more people to come in, but we've got most of our group here today. So I will leave it to you to kind of kick us off when you're ready.
Okay, I've got 9:33 a.m. on Wednesday morning, March 24th, 2021. I'll call the meeting of the Finance Advisory Group of the Climate Initiatives Task Force to order. And Charles, if you're going to be the one to call roll call, if you could do that, I would greatly appreciate that.
Okay, here we go. Brad Lambert,
Here.
Dr. Stephen Barnes, Camille Conway, Pierre Connor,
Here.
Stephanie Ferry, Stephanie, I see you. Oh,
I'm here.
oh,
Sorry.
there
Took
she
me a
is.
minute to
Okay,
unmute.
great. Good, just making sure. It's a good way to check now to see if everything's working too. So good. Thank you, Stephanie. Alejandra Guzman.
I'm here.
Thank you. Michael Jackson. Vic LaFont. Brandon Nelson. It's not picking up, Brandon. I see you trying.
Here.
Here he is. Thank you. And Jeff Schwartz. Okay, so we've definitely got most of our group here today. So I'll turn it back over to you, Brad.
Okay, and Charles, just want to make sure you got Dr. Richardson for the roll call.
I did skip right over you, Dr. Richardson. Sorry about that. Thanks for catching that. You say
Okay.
you're here for the
I'm here.
record. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. We appreciate it. We appreciate everybody who's joined this morning, both members of our advisory group, as well as other members of stakeholder groups or the public. I'll state for the record that we're meeting over Zoom because Louisiana remains in a public health emergency as described by a series of executive proclamations. But we continue to operate in a manner that allows for observation and input by members of the public. And before this meeting adjourns here at whatever time this afternoon, there is a specific agenda item for public comment. I'm going to be brief. We have a pretty full agenda today, and it's the meeting today will be largely led by the planning team. That team is going to walk us through several items, I think, as will be displayed by slides on the screens for all of us to see. And really, over the last 10 days or so, the planning team has participated with kind of the second round of meetings of all 6 sector committees of the Climate Initiatives Task Force. And yesterday began the corresponding advisory group meetings, kind of a second round there that's going to continue through next Monday. While the planning team is going to lead the discussion, I think I'm pretty confident in saying that they want our input, and they tell me that we're going to have some homework today. So while we may hear a lot and be presented with a lot of information today, be thinking about any follow-up or any feedback that you may be able to, whether you think of it this morning or next week, that we can filter that information into the planning team. They're relying on us to really provide our expertise and our experiences as we kind of begin this journey of coming up with an overall climate plan for the state of Louisiana. And lastly, the only other thing I'll say is that there is just an incredible amount of activity that is happening in this space, both at the federal level, at the Wall Street level, ESG. I mean, it is getting more and more challenging trying to keep up with all the news hits that are happening in this space. So I think what we're doing is extremely timely. Louisiana's timing is right to meet this moment. So with that, let's jump right in. And if Charles's email over the last couple of days had the minutes from our previous meeting on December the 8th of 2020. Hope you've all had a chance to review them. If you haven't, if you could take a look at them right now, and I'll be happy to entertain a motion and a second to approve those meeting minutes.
So
This
moved.
is Stephanie. I'll move.
I'll second.
So we've got Stephanie with a motion, and I think that was Brandon with a second.
That's correct.
All in favor, can you please indicate by saying aye?
Aye.
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 All right, guys, thank y'all very much. Charles, with that kind of takes care of the official housekeeping things. I will put myself on mute and allow you and the planning team to kind of take us through the information that you would like to present to us. So again, thanks everyone for being here. And please don't hesitate to jump in with thoughts or ideas.
Great, thanks so much, Brad. And I just wanted to introduce everybody on the advisory group to Allison DeYoung from the Water Institute. She's going to be doing some note taking and be here to kind of help us answer questions as they arise. So that's Allison. Thanks for being here too, Allison. So
Thank you.
Brad did a little bit of this already. I thank him for that introduction. I do want to just kind of put today's meeting in a little bit of context before we jump in and talk about what we're trying to get out of it. So back in February, we brought together all the different sector committees, the task force, and the advisory groups to kick off the action development process. We heard from national experts on different pathways to get to net zero. We heard about specific policies in other states that have been adopted. And we heard about why equity is such an important lens for all of this. We also opened up the public solicitation window at that meeting so that anyone could submit action ideas for consideration under this entire process. As Brad mentioned earlier this month, all of our different sector committees met to discuss specific strategies and actions that fit within their purview and kind of bled over into other groups. And so they've been really kind of figuring out the ideas that need to be explored further, making sure that that there's going to be a template submitted on these different actions, so we have a lot of ideas to evaluate for inclusion in the final climate plan. And then so our job today as an advisory group is to really think through how all those different ideas that come in from the sector committee or the public or wherever they come from, how they can be evaluated in terms of what their impacts are going to be on Louisiana. And so we're going to really kind of get into that process today too. And so I just want to notice too, for the record, that Michael Jackson's joined us. Thanks for being here, Michael. Appreciate it. And so here are basically our desired outcomes for this meeting are really three things. So we want to talk about what we're going to be asking you to forecast, getting your input on that. So we feel like to give you a little background on how that's going to work so that you understand that part. We want to get your input on the criteria that should be used to do that evaluation. So we want to have you not only score some things, but we want your input on how those things could and should be scored. And then finally, we'll spend a few minutes on a look ahead to kind of where things progress from here. In terms of the calendar, our next several steps look like this. So today, again, we're going to kick off the process of forecasting the consequences of some of the different ways to reach our emissions reductions goals. In mid-April, we're going to have another chance to kind of bring multiple groups together and interact with one another. So we're going to have a series of workshops. Instead of one big long meeting, we're going to carve it up into several smaller meetings over a couple days. That's going to provide an opportunity for members of this group to interact on the details of different specific policies and programs that are being designed or thought up by either the sector committees or that have come in through the public and others. And so we're going to talk more about kind of this April meeting later, but that's kind of what we'll do immediately next. And then finally, we will be sending you each a survey to get your input on the consequences of different strategies that are going to be adopted. So we're going to be adding an office hours meeting with the GOCA team and the planning team for all the advisory groups as we're asking you to kind of do this evaluation in case you have any questions about how it is or how to use the survey we send out. And that's going to happen around early May. So that's kind of the next couple months of what we're going to be doing. And then so we'll spend the rest of today kind of talking about this consequence analysis piece. So we really want to start thinking about what that looks like. So the question is, what does the future of Louisiana look like under different scenarios for reducing climate emissions? Ultimately, what we're trying to understand at this stage in our planning process is what Louisiana looks like, both in terms of how well different scenarios help us reach our emissions goals, and also how they impact the other fundamental objectives that we've identified that are driving this process. And again, kind of thinking about the outcomes, we have three different ways of thinking about what success looks like and what we want the future to look like for Louisiana. We've got the vision laid out by the governor in the executive order that says that Louisiana is going to address greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change while also maintaining economic competitiveness. So there's that. There are the established greenhouse gas goals that we've set up that are in line with the Paris Agreement, which is essentially, the math problem, what it looks like for us to do our part and kind of where those reductions can happen. And then finally, we've got the fundamental objectives because we know that how we reach those first two goals is important. And I would remind you that together, all the different groups involved in this process have identified 16 fundamental objectives in the 7 categories that you see on the second half of this slide. And what these fundamental objectives are saying is that all of these different elements like equity, resilience, quality of life, conserving natural resources, a strong economy, and managing for near-term and long-term success also matter alongside the climate greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals. Additionally, kind of as a refresher and to help us stay kind of focused on the outcomes that we want to achieve, we are using the structured decision-making process. So it provides a systemic way to question, evaluate, understand, and communicate the impact of different approaches on those fundamental objectives for the task force so that they're able to make an informed decision. And so this SDM is a mechanism for capturing and incorporating all of the input and expertise of this advisory group and the 3 others from our sector committees and the task force members, as well as the public as we go through this planning process. And so as you can see, there's 6 steps. The sector committees are very busy in step 3 right now, kind of really thinking through and developing out the specific policies, actions, programs to reduce emissions in their areas. And we are starting on step 4, forecasting the consequences, which is kind of our major role to play is going to be here at this step. And so this 4th step of consequence forecasting is really going to occur twice in our process. We are going to do 2 rounds. Today kicks off the first round, where we're going to be thinking through how to evaluate portfolios of the higher level strategies only. And so that's because the actions are still in process. And part of that is because where we are in our process is that we want to kind of get some big directional things sorted out first before we kind of get into the detail. So our goal here is to ultimately, we want to broadly understand the impacts to the objectives across some sample portfolios. And so I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but what we think this is going to do, this is going to help us provide information to the task force so that they can better understand the implications of certain actions and how certain things are connected to other things in the process. So you can see we also have a second round that we're going to be engaging in later on. So kind of in the fall, late summer, early fall, where we're going to get into the action level and bring in more of the specific detailed proposals that are coming in. But that is still to come. So for this round that we're doing today, starting today, we have 2 goals basically at this stage. We want to provide a structured way to allow this group and the other advisory groups to weigh in on the important considerations. I think there are going to be a lot of things we could consider, but we want to really hone in on the most important considerations for how Louisiana reduces its climate emissions and what those anticipated impacts would be of different scenarios. And so this really is the big chance to kind of get input from you all on this. And the second thing is we want to be able to frame some information for the task force, who is ultimately being asked to make decisions about which ideas are finally adopted. So it's going to be important for them to kind of understand, like it says in the slide, what are the realistic limitations of some of the strategies for reducing emissions? What's the scale of what must be done to kind of meet those numerical goals that we have in terms of emissions reductions? We want to help them prioritize which approaches make the most sense for Louisiana based on these impacts to our fundamental objectives. And we want to be able to highlight additional considerations that are critical for ensuring success and positive outcomes for people. And so those are our three big goals from this step of the process. And the way we're going to kind of do this in this first round is through hypothetical future scenarios. And so we're gonna come up with just a handful of hypothetical future scenarios. This is not super different from what we saw from the Princeton study, but these are going to be kind of our own versions of that we're going to create. These scenarios are going to contain multiple strategies, so they're going to be at this high portfolio level, and they're going to be built from options that are being discussed by the sector committees, but they're going to be intentionally designed to highlight major differences between approaches. So none of them are realistic, and none of them are in any danger of being adopted whole cloth as the climate plan. They're intended to be hypothetical. They're intended to kind of show divergence between different pathways. So we haven't figured out exactly what all the different scenarios are yet, but we're getting close to that. And again, it's going to be the goal here is to kind of spotlight big picture implications that are associated with these different hypothetical scenarios. So help us ask questions that are going to need to be asked. Help us know what concerns arise, as we kind of think about these different futures. And so I've got two examples up on the screen here of what a hypothetical scenario might look like, and kind of I hope that'll help kind of explain, just kind of make it more real what we're talking about, and also kind of illuminate the kind of some of the benefits of this. So we've got one scenario that will probably definitely be included is just a business as usual scenario. So the benefit of kind of thinking about a future with no strategies implemented or anything different that's not already being kind of considered or in the works, it's going to help us, again, against those fundamental objectives, understand what do net greenhouse gas emissions look like without a change in course. I mean, how are we doing? It's going to help us think about what the future outcomes be for all the other things, for people, quality of life, for the economy, for the environment, et cetera. How are those things going to be, in the future if things stay the same? So that's one version. And then again, so we are going to send out kind of some kind of, manufactured, for lack of a better word, hypothetical ones. So one of these hypothetical ones could be a scenario where we go all in on renewable energy and electrification. We just kind of pick strategies that align with those two big picture goals above all else. And so then again, we can kind of see by evaluating that set of strategies, we can think to ourselves, what are the limitations of just doing this in terms of the greenhouse gas goals? What can be achieved through this? And that's helpful. We can also think about what are the potential positive and negative impacts for the other objectives in a fully electrified future that's powered by renewable energy and clean power. So we could think about specifically if we do those things, what does the economy look like? What does the environment look like? What's going to happen? And then it also helps us raise questions about what really needs to be considered in terms of a transition to this fully electrified future. What would need to be considered there. So that's kind of an example of two hypothetical scenarios that we are working on pulling together to get your initial impact on. And Pierre, this is great time for a question. Yes.
Perfect. Just want to clarify the business as usual constraints, Charles. So the future, if no new strategies are implemented, because I was thinking that there's a lot of momentum around current investment and externalities to the state that are moving us in a direction in and of itself. So can you just if the business as usual is going to be the, as economists say, ceteris paribus, no other changes, is it with current moving forward, or what's the framework?
Yeah, I think we want to do our best to incorporate the things that are kind of in the works in this, and not to sell ourselves short in any way. But I think that there's a lot of things that we haven't decided yet. How far, if it's an announcement versus an adopted thing versus how do we do all that? And then the level of detail that we're going to be able to get to at this stage is also just not company by company kind of thing. So I think that we're going to do our best to capture the world as it's currently moving, to kind of really highlight things for people. But it's going to come down to kind of the assumptions that we settle on as we kind of build these out for you guys. But we're going to do our best to do it, to be fair to each of these scenarios and kind of really show what they can and can't do through it. Okay, that's a great question. Does anybody else have a question right here? I'm going to take a longer break in a minute. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the second bullet points. I see how that kind of directly impacts what we do, but I want to make sure I understand, to kind of stay in our lane as the finance advisory group. Are we supposed to be looking at these things specifically through the lens of the financial aspect, or are we supposed to go beyond that? I just want to make sure that I'm looking at it in our proper lane, if you will.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna get to that in basically in the next couple minutes. So if you give me a chance, and you can raise that question again if you're not clear after I do a couple more. Thanks.
Perfect.
Stephanie, do you have a question?
Charles.
Oh, okay, Brad. Yeah.
Charles, this is Brad. I just want to just double check this again from a process check standpoint. The planning team, you guys are going to build out or frame up these example scenarios in a couple pages, and then present that information to us. And then we will go through, I guess, maybe individually first, some sort of grading criteria. And then will we come back together as a group to try to put together one advisory group grading criteria, or will we just let our individual kind of grading criteria stand on its own?
So we're going to have one set of criteria. So you've got the process right, I think, Brad. So the planning team will create these different hypotheticals that we think will be the most useful to the task force and to everybody else at this first round. Today, we're going to spend a lot of time with this group, the bulk of our time, talking about how do we create criteria to even give scores on this. And so we are going to get everybody's input on that. At the end of the day, we're going to end up with one, we're calling it a survey, that lets you give a score along those criteria. So the criteria are going to be consistent. And then what you fill out, what you give a score to, kind of to Brandon's point, is kind of going to depend on kind of your expertise, as well as kind of what we think the best fit for our group is going to be. And so if that's okay, I think, does that answer the question, Brad, pretty well?
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm just trying to get kind of clear eyes on the process.
And I think you guys are following along pretty well. This is a lot of information, so I think we're doing great. So I'm going to go to the next one and kind of start talking about some of the finer points of that. Just what we just said.
Wait, Charles, before you go on, I think Alejandro, did you have your hand raised?
Oh, I didn't see that.
I did. I put it down again. So yeah, going back, and perhaps you're going to address this. I was wondering if you're going to provide tangible examples so we can evaluate this. The topic we're discussing is so broad, and there's so many examples, so it's going to be difficult to wrap our heads around specific criteria without something a little bit more solid. So you might have that prepared. If not, I will highly suggest that we select a couple of examples representative of the type of transactions we're evaluating, so we can better wrap our heads around what are the type of criteria that should be addressed.
Completely agree. And I think we're going to be aiming at this first level at the strategy level. So it's going to be broad. It's going to be a challenge. But one of the things that I do want us to be able to say is when you come up, you're trying to say that like a future, a strategy that says Louisiana will increase the use of renewable energy across the entire state. If it raises questions for you, like, well, it depends how we do it. There's going to be so many questions that come up. We want to have a place for you to flag those for us so that we can kind of incorporate those concerns, those issues, those questions into how we actually use the information that's coming in. But you will have portfolios that are at a more detailed level than the examples I just showed you. So you'll have strategies in play that kind of flesh out these hypothetical scenarios to a greater extent. So what at least big picture actions are being considered in this realm.
All right, sounds great. And then just a follow-up comment to something Brandon said, I would expect that there's an intersection between planning and finance and other committees. So, just a comment that I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately we get to the conclusion that there needs to be other items resolved in other committees in order for us to do, our work. So just a thought out there that I wanted to share.
Appreciate it. And then Stephanie, did you have a question too while we're here? Okay, great. And so just to move on, just a hair, and then we can do more questions in just a second too. So we want you to weigh in on the consequences, like we've been saying, of these different hypothetical scenarios. And so then what we want to talk about kind of for this second is just how to do that in a way that's both consistent and useful for the task force, for the planning team, for everybody's benefit. And so when we look back at these fundamental objectives, I think there are kind of many of them do have an economic or financial component. And this is kind of getting kind of at Brandon's earlier question. I check some boxes where I feel like there's at least one of the fundamental objectives within the category that might really benefit from an economics or a finance perspective. We can talk about this. We can alter this. The idea here is that we are going to, where the boxes are checked, we're going to ask you to give a score on the fundamental objectives, on those fundamental objectives. So we're not today saying that conserving natural resources and adapting to climate change are big ones for this group to look at. Obviously, strengthening the economy and the workforce is our main, dead center at kind of what this group has pulled together to help us do. But again, there are elements of these other first three that are going to be important as well. And so we're going to be asking you today to so this chart is showing what you're going to score the hypotheticals against. In terms of the criteria that's being used to kind of actually provide those scores, we're going to focus in on just one of them today. And then if you feel like you're an expert, your expertise would be helpful in kind of thinking through some of these other ones, we'll ask you to kind of send us input on how we should construct the measurements in those other ones. And that's kind of some of the homework that Brad referred to at the top of the meeting. So let me go one more slide and then we'll take another break for questions in a second. And so the way we're going to do this in mid-April, every advisory group member is going to receive information on the hypothetical strategy portfolios and a survey that's designed to elicit your input. It's going to ask you to provide both a score in terms of how well, what you think is going to be the consequence outcomes of it, but it's also going to ask you for a short narrative of considerations and key concerns, kind of to your point, Alejandro, where the limitations of this level of detail get us, so if your concerns or questions there. So this part of the process is really not about which portfolio quote unquote scores the highest. We're not giving it doesn't matter if you get an A+ or an A- in terms of these hypotheticals. It's really intended as a way to kind of get you guys to think systematically about these different future scenarios and to help you flag important issues for us as we go through. And if there's an objective that as you kind of are going through this, so all the advisory group members are going to get the same survey. And so you'll just be active on certain objectives more than other people based on your expertise and what we do. So that's kind of the next step that we're going to. And so does anybody have any questions? And so the next part of this meeting, we're going to talk about the criteria, like how do you decide how well something benefits the economy or economic growth. We're going to do that next, but before we do that, does anybody else have any questions about this part of it? I think we got some good clarification a minute ago. So we'll jump into the kind of the next part where we'll let you guys talk a little bit more, and then we'll see how we feel at the end of that. So I'll just go on then here. Right. So let's talk about how we're supposed to actually assign scores on these hypothetical portfolios. We're trying to develop consistent evaluation criteria that's going to include specific guidance on what to consider in your evaluation. We want to have a unique scale for every fundamental objective, and we hope, we wanted to identify specific relative benchmarks. And so there's an example up here, and this is the tool that we're going to start building today. We are going to create consistent criteria that helps us evaluate every objective so that when something scores, the end goal is that so when something scores very positive, it's meaningfully different from just somebody giving it a positive, or we know what the difference is between neutral and good or neutral and bad. And so we want to try to do the best we can at kind of figuring out how to kind of give those grades under predefined criteria that we're going to create. And so we've got this example on the screen. This is one that we're not going to be kind of charged with, but I think it'll help us kind of think through how this is going to work. And this example here, we've got the fundamental example. The fundamental objective category fundamental objective is to maximize the preservation of natural resources and ecosystem services, which is one of the ones that has been identified through our process. And so we've got these different. First, we've got a scale. The kind of the overall, check mark score that you're going to give it is going to fall within one of these big categories of very positive, neutral, negative, or very negative. And then within that, we've got these guidance criteria, and that's what we're going to talk about today on our fundamental objective in terms of, okay, so how do I give it a very positive? So if we're trying to maximize the preservation of natural resources and ecosystem services, a very positive result would be one where you see large increases in one or more of the following. You've got overall net productivity of commercial and recreational fisheries. You could have acreage of wetlands, mangroves, and other coastal ecosystems that mitigate storm impacts, large increase there, or a large increase in acreage of natural areas available for birding, hunting, camping, and other outdoor activities. And so we've created these sample criteria under each one of these to kind of help us, like I said, help us put the check mark in the right category. The survey that we're developing, this is kind of, we'll do some of it today and some of it will be over homework. And we're looking for, kind of like in this example, we're only looking for probably 4 or 5 criteria for each one of these buckets. We don't want to make this, because again, at the end of the day, all the advisory group members are going to have to try to do this over a handful of scenarios. And so we don't want this to be too extensive. We want to hone in on what are the key considerations that need to be included in this. And then let's see. Yeah, and so the final part is that we're gonna synthesize all of this and send this out to you by mid-April, so that we can start not just the scoring process, but also kind of start getting your feedback on kind of the narrative parts, the parts that raise issues for you, give you heartburn, or saying you really can't make this decision without knowing this or knowing that, and that's kind of what we want to start to see. So we are going to be after we kind of go through this and after we kind of get your feedback on the criteria, we're going to be synthesizing all of that, creating the survey, and then that's what we're going to be sending out in just a minute. And so what we're going to do, I'm kind of trying to get us into the part where you guys get to tell us how to develop this out for our fundamental objectives. And so today we're gonna spend as much time as we need kind of talking about the strengthening the economy kind of fundamental objectives, because that's kind of our bread and butter. After this call, if anybody really wants to help flesh out criteria for any of the other fundamental objectives, you can do that kind of as an after meeting action and send that in to me through April 6th, which I guess is the end of next week, or we have a little bit of time there through April 6th. And then in mid-April, the survey will go out. And then we'll do the second round much later, like I said, in August or September. And so this is the part where I think we're going to get Allison to kind of jump in and start to help take notes in just a second, as soon as we kind of understand which two that we're going to try to think through the criteria for. So we've got the example category that I think is the most relevant for us to kind of spend some time on today, is kind of this strengthening the economy and workforce category. And that category has two fundamental objectives underneath it. We've got the desire to maximize job creation and support for Louisiana workers, and to maximize economic growth. Those are the two that have been identified. Those have been what we've been talking about. And as we're thinking through, what are those criteria bullet points that are going to fall under very positive, negative? What are the categories that we need to worry about? We've got some criteria on the left-hand side of the screen. So can we think about, what are the desired outcomes associated with these goals? What are some of the benchmarks that might help us distinguish positive from negative? Are the metrics that are jumping to mind, are they the most closely related to the fundamental objective? Does it get us closer to what we care about, or is there a better metric that actually I could pick instead? And then we know that the final product can't be comprehensive. There's just too many things to consider. So how can we kind of prioritize and kind of narrow it down to the top 4 or 5 things that really need to be part of the criteria that we do? And so with that, Allison, I think unless you have anything to add, I can end my screen share here as soon as I move this.
Yep, and then I can pull up the notes here. All right, can y'all see this Word doc here? Awesome. So thanks, Charles, for that great overview. What I have here is the main fundamental objective category, and then the two objectives that we're going to talk about. And, I think if we can focus on the criteria, whether qualitative or quantitative, like Charles mentioned, I think that's a great place to start. And if we can get into kind of the scale or the benchmarks, then that's great. But I think let's make sure that we get the criteria right first. So our first one is maximize job creation and support for Louisiana workers. So here's where you all go off mute and tell me what you want to see on this impact scale. I think there's some ones that come to mind pretty immediately. This is not as amorphous a fundamental objective as some of the other ones. So let's hear what y'all think.
I would think obviously higher paying jobs.
Yeah. Glad that wages comes up right off the bat.
I think there could be a criteria around attractiveness of investment or relative capital flows, something if this criteria attracted capital from out of state, for example.
All right.
Perhaps something that utilizes the natural resources that we have here.
Say a little bit more about what you mean by that, Stephanie.
Meaning that, whether it's the topography of the land or the, actual characteristics of the state lend itself well to that industry.
So kind of like a best fit type of
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Brad. I'll jump in there. I think it's trying to take advantage of the things that are available here in Louisiana. For instance, with carbon capture, it's kind of been described. We have operations that
I think we lost you there, Brad. Or is that just on my end?
Now you're on mute, Brad. Your video's back.
Yeah, I apologize.
There you go.
I'm getting kicked out. As I was saying, for instance, in carbon capture, it's been said that Louisiana, we have operations that emit carbon dioxide. We have pipelines that have the ability to move both liquid fuels and gases. And then we have the geology, the space underground, where it's apparently we can put this carbon underground and it's going to stay there. So I think maybe that's what Stephanie's saying is we have those things in Louisiana. How do we maximize those things to encourage job creation, support workers either through new job opportunities or retraining for new job opportunities?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it builds on what Pierre had said, with capital flows and attractiveness, because to the extent that we have a competitive advantage because of what we have available here, the ability to get the capital should be less easier, should be less difficult.
I like to add optimization of processes. So through energy efficiency, we can do things in a better way. So I know this is broad, but to give a good example, when you're planning for buildings and your community does not have access to transportation, we might have some sort of legislation or some sort of build out that provides a share pool of electric vehicles, that can just optimize the space, reduce carbon emissions and provide some sort of solution for workers. So that's just an example, but I think there are many of them that we can just, through design and evaluation, we can just optimize the way we build things and we provide logistics for our community.
I would add that we should make sure we create a diverse supply chain and ensuring that we have different kinds of businesses, whether they are minority-owned businesses, disadvantaged business enterprises, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, to make sure that whatever jobs are created, that we consider the supply chain to make sure that every group in our economy gets a chance to share in the development of the industry.
And I want to kind of follow. I'm happy Michael said that, because I didn't want us to get too far down the list without one of the objectives that we mentioned, which is minority inclusion and so forth. But I think as an extension to that, also the support for that, understanding that there are certain challenges that they have, whether it be from a capital perspective, a financial reporting assistance perspective, truly giving them the tools to be successful in that space as well.
I might add one. I think we're going to need some kind of a measure that's temporal in nature. In other words, timing. Do we evaluate this to have an immediate impact, mid potential later, or long-term impact?
Yeah, I think that's a good flag that we can think about, in particular for the levels of very positive, neutral, I think there's some temporal alignment there that can be considered, time value of money impacts, et cetera, but it's also time value of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So I think that's maybe something that if this group could think through and how we would incorporate that into the impact scale here for job creation, that would be really interesting.
I think as a second element, I think we really need to think about diversifying the economy, out, moving away just from the resources we now have. We always talk about, we have natural resources, we have the coast. That's fine, but we need more than that. If we're going to really have a high employment and also go through the carbon emissions issues, I think we're really going to have to really diversify the economy considerably. And that's maybe beyond this particular topic, but I think it's has to be part of the game plan.
I would second that, Jim. I think, some lens that looks at jobs, jobs in the abstract are great, especially, higher wage jobs that have career pathways. I think to the extent that we can align them with the sectors that we want to be growing in, the proverbial blue and green sectors, I think that should be an essential lens that we view, our job creation in. We frequently use as a talking point here in the city of New Orleans that, the city itself has about $2 billion, give or take, that it's spending between the NDR program and the joint infrastructure program. But, the real money is obviously with the CPRA and the BP dollars that are going to be spent. And, I think just in South Louisiana, that's $20 billion of spend that we know we have in hand. And I think to the extent that we can be very intentional about growing jobs in those sectors and connecting, businesses to opportunities to grow in those sectors, I think that, has to be an essential part of it. So I would put an exclamation point on that, on Jim's comments.
When we're thinking about how to stand up training across our community colleges for the future, there is a significant amount of groundwork that will have to be laid. And we're thinking already about things like, how do we capture existing skills and competencies from certain industries that may be in less demand in the future and transition workers into other jobs using the same skills and competencies, right? And so I have not seen a lot of work done around this issue. How do you transition from, let's say, an oil and gas economy and the type of workers needed in that economy to the type of workers needed in the economy we're talking about here? Are the construction skills the same? Are the manufacturing skills the same? What are we going to have to do to build out a pathway that shows point A to Z? How do we get from, this credential that has value in our economy today to ensure it has value in the future? Or if we need to stack onto it something different. And I just personally have not seen that body of work. Maybe it exists somewhere, but I think that's going to be a critical piece to helping people get their heads around what's possible. Because right now it feels like, well, this is all we know. And there's this theoretical future of work over here. And how do we get from there, from one point to the other? And I believe that a lot of the skills and competencies we're training in now will translate, but I don't know that for a fact. And I haven't seen the work done. So I think that's going to be an important piece. The second piece of that is obviously the array of funding sources for training, for reskilling. If we find that we are going to need additional credentials, or we are going to have to help people pivot into new career pathways, how do we work together? There's federal dollars that can do some of this through workforce training. There are some state, funding for TOPS Tech, for other types of programs, for high schools, for jumpstarts. There's local workforce development boards. This workforce ecosystem of training providers that we have and funding sources will have to work in a very aligned way to make this happen. So I'm thinking about two different things, but I think they're both really important. We're going to have a very well coordinated effort in the workforce training community. And we're also going to need to know what the target is. What are we actually trying to do with a reskilling effort? Or do our people have the competencies that we need with some of the current training, and it's just a matter of shifting into different types of jobs?
Yeah, I think this
More
is
questions than comments, I think.
Yeah, Camille, I think this is a really important line of direction, but we're also like veering into strategy design, right? And so I think what we need to try and do is boil this down into something that you can actually evaluate one of these portfolios against, right? So something that is a criteria about training and credentials and just transition for oil and gas workers, right? And so maybe it's something along the lines of, this portfolio clearly shows that that these resources are a big part of this, or something like that. Because I think this is a really critical piece if we're talking about support for workers. We need to like, the portfolios will need to address this. But I think the question is, how do we phrase that as a criteria?
So Allison, I might offer to build on what Camille is laid out there is, our evaluation is, does this strategy help our workforce position for the 2050 workforce? And the answer could be, no, this strategy doesn't have anything to do with that. Or yes, this strategy will help us rework, retrain, refocus. We can evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
I was
Yeah,
also thinking,
there's layers to that, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to lose all of the detail.
no, I'm glad you
Yeah,
glad you captured it. I just was trying to
Mhm.
summarize it to a measure we could evaluate.
totally.
I was going to move to a different, which is that we could evaluate things around its risk or likelihood too. A strategy might have a unproven technology that would have a high risk of success and implementation. So we would say this is a mature technology, therefore high likelihood of job growth, or this is I'm just trying to then metric it and say high risk, that's a neat strategy, may have no impact.
And just to kind of add on to everything else that's been said, the training and all of the things we mentioned seems like it would serve the benefit of giving Louisiana workers the advantage of getting these jobs. But is there a way to maybe kind of more define the necessity to have Louisiana workers? I don't know, a percentage or something. I don't know how that kind of stuff works, but really ensuring that these jobs don't go to an influx of non-Louisiana workers coming in.
Yeah, there's definitely a chicken and egg here, because one thing we don't like to do in the community colleges is expend taxpayer money and take student dollars to train them for a job that isn't there yet. And so that the sequencing of it is also going to be really important. I don't want to produce them and then they sit out there in the marketplace and the job's not there. And at the same time, I don't want the job to be there and I don't have the workers, and that goes to a bunch of folks from Texas. So but the sequencing and coordination is going to be hugely important to that.
I think we have to be careful as we talk about that. The states grow because of people moving to the state. And I think if we can't start saying, well, only for Louisiana people. I think as we do that, I think we want jobs. If we create jobs, Louisiana people will take them too. And also other people may move in here. I mean, I always like to say, Texas has grown so fast, not because they reproduce faster than we do. They merely get migration. That's very important. If you go to Dallas or Houston, you look at those towns, they look almost like New York in terms of the different people there. And I think that's what we need. We need to bring that in, make it a very hospitable state for out-of-staters to come in and live here. And also, capital money is going to come from out of state almost for sure. We don't have enough capital here to make all these investments ourselves. It's going to come from out of state people as well. So I think we have to be careful as we say that, understand what we want to do. I think that means we have to train our people better, make sure they can get the jobs. if we have them. So
No,
I
Jim,
think
I think that's a great point. I guess I was more speaking to the context of some observations taken like Katrina in context where there were quite a few people who came here, made some really good money and then left. And so I agree with you. You obviously want to have some people come in, but how do we, I guess, capture them if they do come in and don't have this just be a stopgap to make some nice money, then bring it back to wherever they're from?
you know, I understand they've got, and after Katrina, they came in, they took advantage of, when I was down there, they had land speculators essentially buying properties and then held on to it. Market went back up. They got their money and they weren't here anymore. They were never here really.
And to your point, Brandon, that's a current problem as well. If you go, I don't know how recently y'all have been on the coast, but when you see the parking lots of the workers that are going out to platforms, the license plates are from all over. And the last platform that I was on myself, no one there was from Louisiana. They were driving in 10 hours, you know, to drive to the coast to then work for 2 weeks and then drive the 10 hours back home, including the foreman, the lead on that platform. And that's a high paying job. So to your point, Brandon, how do we get them here and how do we keep them here? It's going to be important.
If I could think about trying to take it back to what the major is that we'll evaluate on, if I incorporate what you guys are thinking about, the measure is this a temporary job or a strategy that is construction only, or is this a strategy that creates a permanent position? So we would evaluate to say, well, this is a strategy that is short-term in nature and, you know, like to Jim's point, causes investment that flips an asset, or this is a strategy that is long-term in nature and creates jobs that relate to operations and maintenance.
Absolutely. We have those same conversations around coastal restoration work as well, because some of it is, you know, it's a 5-year project and then it's over, but they need, you know, thousands of workers in the meantime.
And we should evaluate that and then cast our view on whether it's short-term or long-term. I think to capture Jim's earlier point too, though, we right at the very first point, you mentioned average wages, if we want to evaluate that, and I think that's great. I mean, I think obviously there's a criteria that's an absolute number of jobs, right? You know, we're creating higher paying jobs, but did we actually increase the number of jobs? Does this have an impact or no impact?
One other thing I'd like to add, we may want to consider beyond the training of our workers, how do we create the higher educational infrastructure to support industry? Whether or not we create centers of excellence and or programs and curriculum to support the industries that we're trying to develop. I think if we may put a little energy into that or consider that as support for workers, then we probably will create the basis of support to keep people here, and rather than having, you know, the exodus of the influx and exodus of workers when they see an opportunity to come being developed.
You know, one other aspect that goes along with the high paying jobs and the number of jobs that come here and getting people here is the type of business that it is. Is it capital intensive? Does it have assets that will be located here in Louisiana? Is it inventory? Is it actual facilities? Because all of that affects the tax base of that local community that then provides the base on which they get their revenue, whether it's from ad valorem property taxes that then provides the services that might draw someone to come and live in the community as well. If they don't have the tax base, the revenue base to provide those services, they can't attract the people to live there. So it's also, you know, what type of business will it be? If it's a service business, will they be bringing much in the way of tax revenues to that local government to then be able to provide the services the community needs?
That's a good point, and maybe a question back to Charles is that, you know, again, well, we evaluate these things under the current environment, or potentially under some future state? Because I do know that there are initiatives underway to think about our tax structure in Louisiana. And I thought you mentioned ad valorem, and I know that's a potential point that some have an interest in how it's impacted. So we might say this is really good. It brings a lot of assets, but then we might miss it if the tax structure is ultimately changed. But I think your point is, I do agree. We need to decide: is this a strategy that increases e-commerce and internet-only business, or is this a strategy that brings real estate purchasers to the state of Louisiana?
Hey, Pierre, this is Brad again. I think you raised a very good point here. I mean, we're about to start a regular legislative session on April the 12th. There's a lot of talk about tax reform. There could be some items that come out of that from a state level perspective. And then there's all the activity that theoretically could happen in Congress over the next several months about federal tax or policy changes that impact all of these things that we're kind of talking about. Renewables, carbon capture, those types of things. So I think we're in a period here over the next 6 to 9 months where we've got to kind of keep our eyes open on the things that pass or come to fruition at the state and federal policy level.
That's a good point, Brad. It's dynamic, to say the least.
Yeah, the business as usual case, I think, is actually the hardest one to construct for a lot of those reasons.
So there's another category of evaluations that I think that somehow the Finance Committee and the Economics Advisory could opine upon, and that is, unintended consequences. And would we potentially weigh in on, let's just say, for instance, a state level Q45 like carbon sequestration payment? Is there an unintended consequence that actually is a motivation to continue to produce more carbon dioxide? I don't know for sure. I'm not making that statement. I'm just saying we could evaluate the risk of unintended consequences financially to a particular strategy.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, as we're making these suggestions for Louisiana, what are we assuming about the outside world? What's going on in the national economy, maybe even the global? What's happening there? Are we putting some type of suggestions on what that will look like? Because obviously we are a small part of a much bigger equation.
Yes, and sometimes a very small part. So I think what we want you to do is to kind of really flag things like that. That's why it's not just about a check in a box. It's really about saying, giving you the chance to kind of make a note and say, like, if this or X or Y happens, or if the split goes this way instead of that way globally, or if this trend continues, this will have a much different score. I think we do want you to kind of help provide that perspective as you were thinking about the Louisiana context here. So please, don't turn your brain off at any point during these things. If things are just really deeply connected or really deeply dependent on externalities of any kind.
I think the other element there is whatever happens outside may force us to do something here. For example, certainly if GM and Ford say we're just going to make electric cars, that changes the world a great deal for us, that companies will respond to. But then the state has to respond too. We have to respond, different type of industries maybe. So I think and we don't know what's going to happen exactly. But anyway, we need to keep in mind we're playing that type of catch up or that type of game, and we're reacting to a lot of other activities that we have no control over at all. So what we need to make ourselves a very flexible state in terms of different types of jobs that we can support and things like that.
I think Jim makes an excellent point. In fact, the example that he brought up with electric vehicles, I believe that there's a report of key manufacturers that are planning to change certain percentage of their production to electrical. So I think that's an excellent point, and I agree with that. We need to maintain ourselves flexible to address what's going on in a broader context.
And maybe we're already kind of starting to talk about economic growth in general and less about workforce. So maybe we'll just go ahead and totally switch gears into this other one and think more broadly about not just impacts to workers, but about what are some measures, some criteria associated with economic growth.
Yeah, and I think some of these we can move down to the growth category, but we can sort that out later.
Let me give you a little background on the growth issue. And this is several people have brought it up already, but you kind of look back at our state. We've not been a fast-growing state for some time. When we grew fast because of construction jobs. And what's happened, and again, companies make very good decisions. They decide to put a lot of money into capital at the beginning. And then that means over the next 30 or 40 years, they put less money into labor, at least not per worker, but in terms of the number of people they need. And I think manufacturing, and this is not just in Louisiana, across the country, has gone down as a percent of the workforce, but they're much more efficient now, technologically available. And indeed, you go into a big manufacturing company, you see men and women at computers running things. Very different from what it was, say, 40 years ago, very different. So I think we have to see that companies now companies make financial decisions in their best interest, what they should be doing. And typically they become much more, particularly manufacturing, much more capital intensive, much less labor intensive. But the workers they hire are high paid but there are not that many of them. That's why we have to worry about other industries, I think, that we perhaps not even thought about right now, but that we have to worry, how do we get there? I think the growth, and if you look at the states that have grown, they've grown because of increases in service type industries, professional services, which are high paying too, are healthcare. Now, how much more we can go in healthcare, I'm not really sure. But those are the areas where people might be looking: professional services, healthcare, and then if you get into the entertainment or the accommodations, then you get into lower paying jobs for the most part, but they are very people necessary jobs too.
It's an interesting point, Jim, and maybe the evaluation is something around, does this strategy create sticky employment or very mobile? Is there an opportunity that as soon as that, it goes maybe back to our earlier point, but does a particular strategy create internet jobs that can be outsourced out of the state and have therefore limited economic impact?
The construction jobs are really interesting because they bring people in from around, and because these construction talents, it doesn't matter where you live, you can work any place, and that happens. Again, the companies are very good. Now I know over in Lake Charles, we had a lot of construction workers, and the companies made a real effort to look for Louisiana people. And they did that, but at some point to run out of them too. So,
yep, there were both Pierre and Jim's comments made me think of at least two points. One of which might belong in sorry, Allie, in the previous section, and even referencing what Camille was saying before. on the hospitality front, and this idea of sort of identifying skills in the current workforce that can be translated to jobs in the green and blue sectors. We think a lot about hospitality and this idea that customer success is something that's very relevant in a lot of high growth, higher wage industries, and hospitality, which, New Orleans and South Louisiana have obviously a huge, workforce in. That a lot of those jobs are extremely relevant, and there have been some fairly high profile examples of companies that have pre-pandemic and during the pandemic have very quickly put those skills to new uses in some of these industries. And so there might be some, both in terms of how we fashion these criteria, but also in just thinking about some of the subsequent strategies. Someone working in line cook as a line cook, or as in customer success, those are very much like assembly line jobs or process and workflow based jobs that are highly adaptable if we're very intentional about that. And so I think, that touches on a number of, I think, previous comments, but really thinking about where we are and how we can get to where we're going. I think, was a point that Camille was making before that I think certainly, ties back to the point that Jim and Pierre were just making. And then the second piece that I would raise is we had some roundtable conversations in the fall that the city did. And there's a comment from Joni Tuck from Shell, who had, I thought, a really insightful comment that I think, maybe fits in both of these categories. But her comment was around this concept of a light blue collar job. And what Jim was just saying about, a lot of warehouse jobs, nowadays are, logistics jobs are at computers, right? It's not about, working a line as much as it is about, understanding how, systems are working as a part of a larger process. And her call was around how are we both celebrating those jobs, right, in these quote unquote light blue collar positions that blend traditionally blue and white collar roles. But also, I think that might be a criteria that we think about is, yes, industry specific, yes, the wage profile and the socioeconomic and demographic profile, but maybe we want to also think about categories like that and as a criteria for how we're evaluating jobs. And I think, her point was a great one, that one of the kind of aces up our sleeve is that we are a working coastline state. We're a state that, we could brand, instead of just showing pictures of Bourbon Street in New Orleans, we could brand ourselves around light blue collar jobs. This idea that our engineers wear steel-toed boots and things like that. And so I think as we think about growth and as we think about where jobs, where we want to see more jobs growing, I thought that was a concept that was sort of useful to kind of consolidate a number of these threads that we're talking about. So maybe not directly yet, as narrowed down to specific criteria as would be helpful, but I just wanted to get that into the conversation because I thought that was really insightful, and I'm not going to take credit for it because that came from industry.
Just to build on that, the cultural change that's going to be required is really important. For the past year, we've been working to identify people out of work due to COVID and help them launch on career pathways in growth industries with higher wage jobs. So that looks like taking a hospitality worker, to your point, transitioning to something else, healthcare, IT, transportation, manufacturing, or construction. Sometimes people have chosen their line of work because they just love the culture of being in a restaurant, and it's really hard to change their mind. That's one piece of it, is how do you market a lifestyle change to people? The second part is they don't understand that they could get reskilled relatively quickly. In their mind, okay, I'm going to go work in green energy. Well, that's a 4-year degree, or that's going to be a year of my life I'll never get back, or whatever. And it could be an 8-week retraining program. It could be an 8-week reskilling program. It could be a paid apprenticeship 8-week retraining program. And so the messaging around how we're going to speak to workers about the opportunities is going to be really important to getting their buy-in and letting them take a risk on something that's unknown.
This is Brandon, and I apologize on the front end because aside from undergrad, micro and macroeconomics, the further we get away from workforce labor, I think tend to get a little bit shaky on economic growth. But one of the contexts I remember, and that's I think kind of goes to the sticky situation, is the film industry, right? And so what we recalled is that the shooting of movies and so forth were one thing, but they had a lot of mobile vans, and they could come and kind of go if there were better incentives. And so there was always this notion of, well, how do we build the places where they can do the editing, right? Like where they had to have brick and mortar, and that those were kind of the things that created a more sustainable industry. And so when we think about capital infrastructure, hauling trucks and so forth, moving dirt, those are nice and dandy, but those can be moved in a few days. Whereas what are some of the things we have that requires a plant or something like that that's a little bit more difficult to move? And so that could be some consideration. And then I think just finally overall, and I know we've kind of alluded to this on the top side, but I think on the bottom, technology, as I look at the youth and 5-year-olds on iPads and 4-year-olds on iPads, when we think about sustainable industry and attracting people, young people, it seems like you have to have a technological kind of component. So those are kind of two things I think that probably or possibly could kind of help the overall economic growth discussion.
So I think, in order to be sustainable, it has to be economic. We're not going to attract capital that's a negative rate of return. So a clear metric here is, does a strategy have a positive NPV? Is it IRR positive? And is it in a standalone, or does it require incentives? And so Brandon brings up a good point. If the strategy requires incentives, it may be short-lived until the next legislature convenes and removes those incentives. So evaluating a strategy on its creating value to an investor or not, and whether it's driven by incentives or not.
I think the thing about incentives too is that we can do an incentive, but every other state can too.
Mm-hmm.
So you get into a competition almost. That's what happened with the film credit. I think we put the film credit out in 2002, and now I think every state has one, or most states have them anyway. And so now you can't get rid of it because it's competitive as such. So I think ideally we can win industries because we have a very good workforce, a good tax structure without any built-in incentives as such, except for very standard. And then I think we have to make it. They want to move they say we can move people there easily. They want to come to live in Louisiana. I think that's very important to that overall a good place to live attitude. And I don't know if we won that all the time or not. And if you look around the state about the growth areas have been to the south of I-10 for the most part. The northern part of the state has really, really, over time, lost jobs.
These are great. And I hope that, we that you will continue to raise these points in the upcoming cross-sector action development discussions, because I think we're going to have plenty in terms of criteria to develop these impact scales, but I don't want to lose all this great content, because I think that, you'll be able to raise these points in the cross-sector sessions that will help get these things into the action development process, which will be really good. It'll help inform those in a great way.
And before we move on, I just want to see the only thing that I haven't heard that maybe Stephanie, you can overrule me, but is there anything about kind of a criteria around it. How does it impact the state's overall like financial posture? I'm thinking about kind of the big picture business climate, bond rating type stuff that I know you talk about a lot, Stephanie. Is there something there? That's the only thing I feel like that I have on my list that I didn't hear anything about.
Yeah, or insurance.
Yeah. Well, it affects pretty much every aspect of our lives. You know, insurance was just brought up, and that absolutely plays a factor, because if businesses or, you know, homeowners can't get insurance to live in the community where they want to live, or the cost is exorbitant, then obviously that affects population. And again, you know, population, where that moves, and tax structure, how you tax them in order to get those governmental revenues, affects how the markets view the credit quality of the state of Louisiana or any of its local governments. So it's a combination of population and how we tax, because if, you know, the current tax structure is based on asset value, you know, homeowners, the value of their homes, how much homestead exemption we give. For businesses, you know, the industrial tax exemption program, you know, if that's what we're using, or if we're moving to more of a service economy, how will those governmental entities get revenues from that type of business? So all of it is combined together. It's about, where do you get your population from? Is your population growing? And how does government get revenues associated with that population and the businesses that are there, in order to provide the services to the communities that the residents need and demand, and provide revenues at a sustained level that the markets believe will continue to be sustained over the time period necessary to, because the vast majority of these local governments are borrowing debt to provide, you know, water and sewer facilities, electric generation facilities, community centers, parks and recreation, you know, all of it, hospitals. So they have to have the tax base and the right revenue structure to be able to generate the revenues, to be able to go to the market and convince investors we're going to be sustainable for a long period of time. And so buy our debt and buy it at a rate that's very attractive. And if they can't get access to that capital, they can't provide the services that residents need to be able to live there, and the residents leave. So it really all, you know, comes together to affect the viability of those local governments to be able to access the capital they need to provide services. And it is, as you know, from the wealth of articles and papers that I've sent to you, it is a very hot topic within the municipal market for local governmental borrowers. The whole term ESG, you know, environmental social governance, is definitely the buzzword within the market these days. And you know, there are some differences on exactly what those terms mean, and sustainability is thrown into the mix. For us, being on the coast is a huge issue, because it has become such a high profile topic in the market, and all credit participants are looking at borrowers, local governments, when they borrow debt, they're looking at their sustainability. How are you going to continue to operate going forward? Will you be able to continue to get insurance? Will you need to relocate population from the coastline? I don't know if you pronounce it Isle de Jean Charles or Ile de Jean Charles, but either one, you know, that definitely made the headlines. And I heard from bond insurers and rating agencies about that particular news article, the fact that that community was having to be relocated. And, you know, you're talking to someone in Minneapolis or New York or San Francisco, they have no understanding of what the Louisiana coast looks like and the specifics relative to that particular community versus, you know, say Alexandria. And so it is something that I think that the state, and hopefully what will come out of this committee, is that there is a real path going forward, because I think it's something that we do have to address. Perhaps us more than many other communities in the interior of the United States. It is something that we need to look at.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Well, and also speaking to the dynamic environment that we find ourselves in. I mean, the Federal Reserve yesterday said they were creating a new financial stability climate committee that's going to be charged with developing and implementing a program to assess and address climate-related risk to financial stability. So the U.S. Central Bank has created a new committee yesterday, and theoretically, that committee is going to produce something, guidance, regulations, that, again, in this overall broad topic of potential climate change risk on the financial markets.
Well, yeah, you bring up a good point. You know, it from my perspective, it seems like all segments of the financial markets are focused on this, keenly focused on it. So you have investors, and if anyone, listens to or reads what some of the larger investors have to say, some of the really, large institutional investors have weighed in on this subject, saying that this is an important factor, and going forward, they're going to scrutinize it more as time goes on. One in particular is Larry Fink with BlackRock. He's been very vocal about his opinions about sustainability and where they're going to invest their money based on the sustainability of that either company or local government that they're investing in. So there's that aspect. There are the rating agencies who are now trying to factor into ESG in the ratings that they provide for issuers, for local government. They, I believe both at this point may have, or not both, two of the rating agencies, I believe I am aware of having purchased data analytics companies that look to determine the sustainability of local government. I'll give an example. Moody's, I believe it was, downgraded Minneapolis after the George Floyd event. I'll see if I can find a copy of that report and provide that. So that's just one example of the S, the social, affecting a local government credit rating because of the policies that they had in place. Environmental is the one that obviously I've focused on the most because of being here in Louisiana. You have the National Association of Insurance Commissioners that has been looking at this ESG criteria for a while now, and they're doing that for their members as an operating strategy, but it matters to local governments because insurers are also a large buyer of municipal bonds. So it affects how they look at investing their money as companies. And you mentioned the Fed. They certainly have weighed in recently. That affects local governments to the extent that they go to the local bank to borrow money. It also affects companies and how they will access. It affects homeowners because to the extent that they start looking at where you live as to whether or not you'll be able to get a loan to finance your home, it affects the individual. And on top of that, we've had the Securities and Exchange Commission recently announced the formation of a new board to look at ESG factors and disclosure by issuers, whether that's corporate or municipal, and they don't have the ability to oversee municipal, but with respect to fraud. So what they're looking at specifically with municipal issuers, like the state or local government, is when they put out those offering documents that are selling those securities to the market, are they accurate in their disclosures? Are they accurately disclosing their environmental, social, and governance-related risk? And that starts to get to be very tricky because what's considered material to the market and what is more opinion versus fact. And so it's a very hot topic and it's developing. So it touches every aspect of finance.
Thank you, Stephanie, and everybody that commented there. Vic or
Hopefully I
Alejandro?
synthesized all of that correctly. That was a
Yeah.
lot. It's great though.
It's really good. I just wanted to give Vic or Alejandra a chance to kind of weigh in on either of these two before we kind of close this out. I feel like I haven't heard from y'all in a minute, but just if not, that's okay too.
No, the last comment was great. I think that the environment that we provide ultimately will affect finance decision from, the market in general. So I just, kudos to that comment. I couldn't agree more.
Thanks. All right, Allison, do we have enough here to kind of move on to just look ahead a little bit for the next steps and then
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, again, I think like I'll have to do some sorting on the back end because I think some of these, we've talked about job creation and growth in both of these categories. So I'll do some sorting, but I definitely think we have enough here to create some really good criteria for this impact scale. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And so I just have a few more slides to show. Let's make sure I'm on the right. And then to kind of talk about what the next steps are. Can you see the PowerPoint screen again from me? Looks
Yep.
good? Okay,
Yep.
great. So there it goes. Okay, so obviously, we just talked about, the one set of objectives under strengthening the economy and workforce. We know that there are, implications for finance and economy that are occurring in these other areas. So if you feel like really passionate about helping kind of develop criteria under some of these other categories, we are completely open to that, but it is optional. And that's what I hope you can kind of share with us after the meeting if you have any additional thoughts. But I think this was a really good exercise to get you to understand kind of what we are looking for as we shape out the same type of scorecards for these other fundamental objectives. And so again, so that's what we're calling homework here. You can send that directly to me if you have any thoughts on any of the other fundamental objectives. And then again, the survey is going to go out in mid-April, and that's where we're going to have, you're going to see the hypothetical scenarios that we're asking you to evaluate. We're going to ask you to put a rank there, but you're also going to kind of see this conversation we had and the conversations that all the other advisory groups are having, kind of fleshing out the criteria under each of those scores. And so once the surveys go out, we do know, even though we haven't sent it out yet, we know the deadline is going to be around mid-May because we want to be able to kind of have that ready for the next meeting of the full task force, this kind of reaction to these different scenarios. And then, so just to kind of look at that in a calendar view, if you will. So in mid-April is again when we're going to kind of have a chance to interact across different silos, so we can kind of some of these really good insights you guys had today. We can kind of make sure that people are thinking about those as they're developing an action or a strategy on the front end. That's going to happen in these cross-sector review workshops in mid-April. The public phase of being able to send in action items, and for anybody, not just for the public, but for anybody, it's going to be at the end of April. And then also in that late April, once we send these surveys out and you guys get it and you say, well, I have a lot of questions, we're going to have a special time set aside for you or anyone else on these advisory groups to be able to ask us questions. What did you mean by this? How are we supposed to answer this? That kind of stuff. We'll be kind of letting you know when that will be, and that'll be sometime in late April on that. And then, again, I kind of mentioned this before. So this cross-sector review workshop, it's not going to be one marathon meeting. It's going to be probably 4 or 6 2-hour kind of conversations. And so I think the plan that we have now is to kind of, for us to allocate you to a group that we think that you would have the most fun on or maybe the most helpful to. But we're not going to do them concurrently. We'll do them over time so that you can attend all other ones and kind of see what's going on if you want to, if you're able to join more. So expect, kind of at least one kind of assignment, and we can discuss that if you have strong feelings about which one you get to. We don't know the exact topics yet either. So we're still working on the topics. We'll figure out the right way to allocate folks across them so that everybody is in at least one of these conversations. And then you can also opt in to other ones as you see fit. And then the last I think the last piece I have is just that, you guys are experts on a lot of different things. And if you want to submit an action that needs to be evaluated or included in one of these in the climate plan, please do that. It is open. There's this website where you can submit it. There's a PDF version that you can email in or mail in. There's a shorter Google form version. I just wanted to make you aware that that's possible. So if you have ideas that pertain, to the entire economy or to certain industries or certain things that you know well, please feel free to do that as well. And then that's the last thing I have for you. Unless there are questions from this group, we can move into the public comment phase, Brad. But I'm happy to take any other questions about what we did today or what's going to happen in the near future.
I just want to thank the members for their enthusiastic participation. A lot of great ideas, a lot of great input provided. So thank you very much for that. And let's try to continue to build on this body of work that we're forming and shaping as we continue to move through this process. So thank y'all very much.
Yeah, definitely. I want to echo that too. So if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, can we officially enter public comment phase here?
Yes, please do so.
Really
Brandon,
quick,
do you have a
Charles, one
thought?
quick question. Yeah, no, more just a question. And this is a little bit of naivety on my part, but some of the things that we're throwing out, ultimately, like who, I guess, polices these as we go forward? Are these groups the ones that kind of police where we stand with this, or are there people at state level that police the job creation, where they're going, or just all of the different things? I imagine it's different groups, but I'm kind of trying to get an idea of how we keep track of these criteria that we're laying out.
So half the point of this is to be transparent about how decisions are being made throughout this entire process. So when somebody puts out a strategy or an action, we can see, it scored badly on this, and scored great on this, and this. Ultimately, the task force gets to decide what gets fully adopted. But when they do that, that record will be there of kind of what the concerns are or what the advantages are. And we'll kind of know that, and that'll get to be part of the accountability that kind of folds into there. So it is kind of different groups. That task force is a amalgamation from some state folks, industry folks, environment and community folks, kind of a broad mix there. That's kind of how I would answer that now. And then in terms of the implementation of these different things, in terms of how well it encourages workforce transition and succeeds in all the things we hope it succeeds in doing, that's going to depend largely on kind of who's in charge of implementing the thing or tracking it or whatever the typical checks and balances are associated with it. So whether maybe somebody implements it but somebody else is already assigned to kind of making sure it works right, then that we'll just kind of have to rely on those. Anybody else? Okay, so we have one participant in the webinar on the side. Clark Vega, do you have a comment you'd like to make during the public comment phase?
Oh, no, I don't. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem at all. Just wanted to give you that opportunity while you're here. And then, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking on our web page, our email address, and I don't see any that have come in related to our meeting today. So I think that we are free to entertain a motion to adjourn if that's your preference.
Certainly. Again, a very, very productive almost 2 hours here this morning, and I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So we'll.
Thank you, Michael.
Second.
Thank you, Pierre, and certainly wish everyone a good remainder of the week. And Charles, thanks to you and the planning team for keeping us on track, and we'll continue to evolve. And I think, as several of the members said, it'll be important to be flexible as well. So thank y'all very much.
Bye, everybody.